My name is Marion. Sitting across from my son, Jake, in the boardroom, I can still feel the sting of that Christmas Eve. The look on his face as he struggled to comprehend the truth was etched in my memory. It all started on Christmas Eve at Jake's luxurious 4-story mansion in San Francisco. He had always boasted about this house as a symbol of his success. I was standing at the end of the long, elegant dining table, holding a platter of sumptuous prime rib that I'd spent the entire day preparing. Suddenly, Jake pushed back his chair. The screech of the chair legs against the marble floor was deafening, drowning out the soft Christmas carols playing in the background. He stood up, his voice booming, "Mom, you've got to start paying rent or pack your bags and leave. You've been freeloading here for far too long." For a split second, I thought I had misheard him. The room fell into a deathly silence. I could hear the crackling of the fireplace and the rapid beating of my heart. There were about 25 people in the room, neighbors, colleagues, extended family, and my daughter-in-law, Lily. She sat there sipping her champagne, as if this was a perfectly normal thing to happen. I felt a flush rise to my face, not from embarrassment, but from a deep-seated disbelief and heartbreak. Jake stood there, arms crossed, waiting for my reaction, as if I were a troublesome tenant. I set the platter down on the table before my hands could start trembling. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he had no idea who I was. He didn't know that the house he so proudly claimed as his was part of a real estate empire that my late husband, Robert, and I had built from scratch. The luxury car in the driveway? It was leased under the company's name, a company that Jake knew nothing about. And Lily's designer credit card? It was funded by the profits of our business. All he saw was an overstaying mother. In that moment, I knew that the bonds in our family had been broken long before he uttered those words. Something inside me went still, like a calm before a storm. I didn't say a word at first. I simply placed the prime rib at the end of the table and wiped my hands on the apron I'd worn for the past 8 hours. The once lively chatter in the house faded into an uncomfortable quiet. Everyone pretended to look elsewhere, avoiding eye contact with me. I saw Aunt Grace, who had come from Boston, shift in her seat and look away. She was always too timid to stand up for anyone, let alone me against my son. Jake's colleague, a young man named Ryan, cleared his throat and took a big gulp of his wine, feigning interest in the Christmas tree in the corner. Lily glanced at her phone, as if she had more important things to do. The only notification on her screen was an advertisement from a high-end fashion brand she endorsed. She looked prepared, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Maybe she had even encouraged Jake. I took a deep breath and said quietly, "Jake, is this really the right time for this?" He shrugged, "It's overdue, Mom. You've been here for months without contributing. It's not sustainable. Lily and I have talked about it, and it's only fair." Fair? The word cut through me like a knife. I saw Lily straighten her back, as if to confirm their united front. They were on one side of the table, and I was on the other. The invisible line had been drawn so precisely. I stepped back from the table and untied my apron. "You're right," I said, surprising myself with my calmness. I shouldn't impose on anyone's home, especially during the holidays. Jake blinked, clearly confused by my quick acceptance. He had expected a fight, a scene. Instead, I folded the apron and placed it beside the stack of plates. "I'll gather my things tonight," I said. Someone gasped, maybe Aunt Grace or one of Lily's friends. But I wasn't paying attention. My eyes were fixed on Jake. For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of doubt cross his face. It was just a momentary hesitation, not enough to take back his words, but enough to show that he hadn't expected me to leave so easily. Lily let out a soft sigh of relief, so quiet that only I could hear it. It was the sound of victory, as if she had successfully pushed me out of a life she thought she could manage without me. I walked towards the hallway, feeling more like a stranger than a mother. Along the way, I passed the family photos on the wall. Most of them were from Jake's childhood, me holding him on his first day of kindergarten, smiling at his college graduation, and crying at his wedding when Robert couldn't be there. And yet, somewhere along the way, I had become someone he could dismiss with a single sentence. In the guest room, the world felt cold and unfamiliar. The bed sheets I had washed a few days ago still smelled of lavender. My small suitcase was in the corner, half open with neatly folded clothes inside. I hadn't planned on leaving. I hadn't planned on being thrown out of the life I had helped build. When the door closed behind me, I finally let my guard down. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of years of sacrifice. There was a moment when I wanted to cry, to release the pain in my chest. But I didn't. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered neighborhood. The street was peaceful, lit by warm Christmas lights and decorated evergreen trees. It looked like a Christmas postcard. Inside, my world was falling apart. I sat on the edge of the bed and clasped my hands. The truth that Jake didn't know, the truth he had never bothered to ask about, was burning at the back of my throat. The house, the car, the credit card, none of them belonged to him. They were part of the legacy that Robert and I had built. I realized then that the real problem wasn't the material possessions. It was that Jake had forgotten who I was, the woman who had raised him, supported him, and built a life for him. Maybe it was time for him to remember. I left the guest room with my suitcase in hand. The house felt different. It wasn't the home I used to know, where Jake would run down the stairs on Christmas morning in his mismatched pajamas. This place felt like a showpiece, beautiful on the outside but empty inside. As I walked down the hallway, the voices from the dining room drifted towards me. The initial discomfort had turned into a dull murmur, as if my leaving had smoothed over the awkwardness and allowed them to resume their celebration. I paused and heard someone laugh. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was the sound of people choosing to ignore what didn't concern them. I reached the front door and put on my coat. Jake appeared behind me as I wrapped my scarf around my neck. He didn't look angry, just impatient, like someone dealing with a minor annoyance. "Mom, you don't have to leave right now. I just needed to set some boundaries." "We can talk tomorrow," he said, rubbing his temples. "Tomorrow," I repeated softly. He didn't hear the weariness in my voice or see the resignation in my eyes. He simply nodded and went back to the dining room. I stepped outside into the cold. The air stung my cheeks, but I welcomed it. It felt more honest than the false warmth inside the house. My car wasn't far. Jake had insisted I use one of the company cars a few months ago, saying it would make my errands easier. Back then, I thought he was being considerate. Now, I knew he just wanted to feel like the provider, even though the car was from a company he had never contributed to. I brushed the snow off the windshield and sat in the car for a long time, my hands resting on the steering wheel. Across the street, a family was taking a Christmas photo. The father lifted his daughter to place the star on the Christmas tree. Their laughter filled the air. I watched them for longer than I intended. It reminded me of the happy times Jake and I had shared. What had gone wrong? When had the bond between a mother and son become so strained? As I drove away, the image of Jake, arms crossed and eyes cold, kept coming back to me. But beneath the pain, there was a new sense of clarity. By the time I reached my apartment in Oakland, the snow had gotten heavier. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a few dim lights flickering in the cold. I carried my suitcase up the stairs. The familiar smell of my hallway, a mix of laundry detergent and old carpet, greeted me. Inside my apartment, everything was just as I had left it. Quiet, simple, and mine. I locked the door and set the suitcase near the couch. My legs were weak, but I didn't sit down. Instead, I walked to my desk, turned on the lamp, and opened my laptop. I logged into the Golden Gate Realty system, a system Jake knew nothing about except that it was my old job. The dashboard showed a list of properties, each one a part of the legacy Robert and I had created. I clicked on the address of Jake's house. Lease agreement, landlord's signature, renewal date, February 15th. I stared at the screen for a long time, letting the truth sink in. Jake had treated me as if I were a burden, when in fact, he and Lily had been living off the fruits of my labor. The hurt I had felt earlier turned into a sense of resolve. I clicked the button to generate a non-renewal notice. The form filled out automatically, cold and formal. My name appeared only in the legal section. Jake would see the message, but he wouldn't know it was from me. Maybe that was the only way he would listen. I pressed send, and the notification disappeared with a soft chime. In that moment, the weight in my chest lifted a little. It wasn't enough to erase the pain of that night, but it was enough to remind me that I still had control over my life. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. My mind was racing, and I couldn't sleep. The apartment was cold, and I wrapped an old shawl around my shoulders and stood by the window. Oakland was quiet at that hour. The sky was a deep shade of blue, almost black, with a thin silver glow starting to spread on the horizon. I replayed Jake's words and expression from the night before. I wondered what Robert would have said if he had been there. He had been gone for 9 years, but his presence still lingered. By mid-morning, I forced myself out of the house. Staying inside felt suffocating. I drove to the Golden Gate Realty Administrative Building in downtown San Francisco. I rarely went there these days, as the company ran smoothly without my constant involvement. But today was different. I needed to face the life I had kept hidden from Jake. When I arrived, our CEO, David, was already in his office. He looked up, surprised, and stood up immediately. "Marian, I didn't expect to see you today," he said, his voice gentle, as if he could sense something was wrong. I took off my gloves slowly, buying myself a moment to gather my thoughts. "I sent the notice last night," I said. He nodded, understanding right away. "For Jake's property?" "Yes," I replied, my voice steady, but my hands tightening around the gloves. It needed to be done. David studied my face, trying to understand the situation. "How did he take it?" "He doesn't know yet, but he will soon," I said. He motioned for me to sit down, and I sank into the familiar chair across from his desk. I remembered sitting there with Robert years ago, discussing our plans to buy our first real estate project. Back then, the room felt too big for us. Now, it felt small because of the weight of history I carried. "You're doing the right thing," David said. "Sometimes, people need a wake-up call to learn." I looked out of the window at the San Francisco skyline. The tall buildings were like steps towards the sky, shimmering in the winter light. I realized how long I had lived in the shadows of this success, while Jake knew nothing about it. "It shouldn't have come to this," I whispered. "No," David agreed softly. "But it has, and now he has to face the consequences." After a moment, he reached for a folder and placed it in front of me. "These are the updated financial statements you requested last month. I thought you might want to review them." I opened the folder slowly. The pages were filled with numbers, balances, and projections. It was a world that Jake had never shown any interest in. My thumb brushed across a quarterly report that listed the rental income from his house. Seeing it in black and white made my heart ache. He had spoken to me as if I were a burden, when in fact, his entire life had been supported by the empire I had built. I closed the folder gently. "Thank you, David." As I stood up to leave, David asked me, "Marian, what do you hope happens next?" I looked at him for a long time. The truth came slowly. I don't want him to suffer. I just want him to grow. David nodded, understanding as a father himself. "Growth is never easy." "I know," I replied. "But he's my son, and I can't carry him anymore." As I walked out of the office, the cold wind hit me. It felt like the world was pushing me forward. My phone buzzed in my pocket. When I looked at the screen, my heart skipped a beat. It was from Jake. "Mom, I got the notice." What's going on? Please call me. I didn't answer. Not yet. Not until he was ready to hear the truth without turning it into an argument. I put the phone back in my coat and stepped into the street. The winter sunlight glistened on the snow on the sidewalk. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of determination. I knew the real reckoning was still ahead, but I was ready for it. And then, there I was, sitting across from Jake in the boardroom. He sat there, his fingers tightening around the folder he had brought, trying to understand how the woman he had treated like an inconvenience was now the one in control. "Mom, what is this?" he finally whispered, his voice small in the large room. I folded my hands on the table and let the silence settle before answering. "Jake, this company exists because your father and I built it long before you were even born. We kept it quiet so you could grow on your own, not live in our shadow. But when you spoke to me the way you did, you left me no choice but to show you the truth." His mouth opened, but no words came out. A look of shame crossed his face. This was real shame, not the kind he used to avoid responsibility. "I thought I was helping you," he murmured, looking down at the table. "I thought you needed me." "You thought wrong," I said softly. "It's not that I don't want you in my life, but you never asked. You just assumed. You acted out of pride, not love." The words hung in the air, fragile and yet powerful. He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." For a moment, neither of us moved. I could see the little boy he used to be, the one who held my hand crossing the street, the one who cried when he lost his first tooth, hiding behind the man he had become. I stood up and walked around the table. When I placed my hand on his shoulder, he let out a breath he had been holding for so long. "You will grow from this," I said. "Growth happens when you face the parts of yourself you've been avoiding." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I want to do better." "I know," I whispered. "And that's why we're here." Outside the boardroom windows, the city of San Francisco shimmered in the winter light. Inside, for the first time in a long time, Jake finally saw me, not as a burden, but as the woman who had built a life for him. And in that quiet, painful, but necessary moment, our family began to heal.